In the late 20th century, almost on the verge of the 21st century, we've come to understand as a population of curious beings, we've come to understand one of the incredible truths that have been shunted aside for the last couple hundred years, 200-300 years. The truth was this, that the intertwining of polarities with a mediating third changes the pace of integration from a simple arithmetic development to a geometric progression. Instead of having a linearity which goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, one has a jump in terms of powers, 1, 10, 100, 1,000, so that by the time one would count to 4, in an arithmetical sense, one is already to 1,000. By the time one would count 7, arithmetically, one would be at 1,000,000. This rising of the geometric curve has a quality in mathematics which is called asymptotic. When your progression no longer moves by causality, 1 causes 2, 2 causes 3. Instead of moving by causality, it moves by jumps of power. This, in the Hermetic tradition, in the ancient wisdom tradition, was always a sign that symbols were compressing experience into sets that jumped by power base. That the natural world, in a ritual sense for us, can only move in a causal, arithmetical way. We can only literally take one step at a time. And so some of the most effective therapies in the late 20th century, like Alcoholics Anonymous with their 12 steps, say take one step at a time. Meaning go back to this most basic primordial ritual comportment, only do things arithmetically for a while. Get used to the fact that only one step at a time works. And it works well enough to get you around. In the wonderful comic fairy tale with Bill Murray called What About Bob? The featured novel in there is Baby Steps. If you can't get from where you are to where you need to be, well then just take baby steps. And baby steps, one step at a time, will get you there. And of course Bill Murray becomes the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist becomes a casualty. Who ends up suing his patient. We're looking at ritual now, so we're looking at arithmetical, one step at a time processes. But we're looking ahead now for the first time. We've been watching our feet take one step at a time. And I'm just reminding us to look up now and look at this horizon. Not just where we're taking our steps, so that ritual gives us a confidence that what we're doing is working. But ritual is most effective when it is one step at a time. The objectivity of existence is a function of the confidence of being able to take one step at a time. We are convinced that we exist because we can touch something namely one step at a time. Not only can I touch a book or touch this table, but I have confidence that my causal reaching out, my desire to reach out, will make this hand reach out, and I can get to objects and they will be there. Now in a scientific way, this is called empirical. Empirical. And the simple empirical scientific ritual is that there's a stimulus and a response. And the response as a motion is called a reflex arc. So there's a stimulus and a response along a reflex arc, and that they go together, and that's a causal vignette. So that ritual convinces us that existence is real because this process works. What I'm reminding us of is that it works arithmetically. And while it does work arithmetically, it has limitations. Now you can walk from Los Angeles to Mexico City using baby steps. It's going to take you a long time. In order to move from arithmetical step-by-step causality to a geometrical jumping by powers, takes the condensation of ritual objectivity into symbolic reality. So that the powers are going to be symbols, symbolic levels. But we are going to discover that symbols do not occur in nature. It is a projection, it's a reading into, it's a supposition on a colossal scale to think that symbols come out of nature. They do not. They're not in nature at all. There's no way. The only thing that can come out of nature is the step-by-step causality of the objectivity of ritual comportment, the ritual disposition. Symbols come out of experience, not out of nature. And so in our education, we're trying to pay attention to the fact that there is definitely a sequence by which our maturation has happened. And that if we can but patiently trace with the finger of our attention, even just once, the cycle of the actual maturation, we will have come to a conscious awareness that any opportunity or situation that presents itself to us falls within somewhere on this cycle. And if we can get really good at recognizing where on the cycle this situation is, we will know better what to do. We will know how to deal with it in its terms. We will know how to move it to the next stage or a higher level, or to go back to a lower, more fundamental level, or how to braid it into our life, into our person. So this education is like developing a compass. It's like a compass for civilization, so that we can navigate in our lives. And the compass has a definite mandala pattern to it, a definite orientation. But the needle does not point north like on a compass, it points to the present moment. So wherever we are, that's where the needle points. So this education as a compass orients us to what actually is happening. Now, what we have found in looking at ritual is that the present moment is very slippery. The very present instance is very slippery. It tends to slip into the past, or it tends to slip into a future, and tends not to stay present. It's a very curious, very peculiar quality. It's what used to be called traditionally the mystery of life. That the present instant is so quick that we're tempted to assign it a phantom quality sometimes. And in fact, the whole basis of neurosis is to not believe in a present moment, and to flee to the future or to flee for security in the past and not have confidence that any present moment actually happens. When existential phenomenological psychotherapy was being developed in the late 1960s in Europe, one of the developers, a philosophical analyst named Maynard Boss, said that the cross of orientation falls on its side and becomes the X of unknown. that the neurotic doesn't have any confidence that there is an orientation that you could trust because it isn't there, and therefore everything is unknown, and therefore you have to be anxious all the time because it's only by virtue of your being anxious that you have any ground to stand on. And that you don't really want to get cured of your anxiety because that would kill you. Now this is exactly the diagnosis made by Lucretius in 50 BC when the Roman Republic was crumbling. He said, "We do not have the courage to endure the cure for problems which we can no longer endure." He wrote that just 3 years before they murdered Julius Caesar for saying that he had become a god. That the Roman Republic had become his divine kingdom. He was murdered for the same reason by his friends in Rome that Jesus was murdered by his Jewish kin in Jerusalem. This obviously then is a very resonant issue. It has a lot of resonance to it. So we have to move from having confidence based upon an arithmetic causality, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that kind of linearity, which certainly develops and certainly is necessary, but it has to be changed. How is it changed? It's changed from an arithmetic to a geometric. A geometric process that moves by powers, 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1,000,000, 10 million, 100 million. You see, you go so quickly up that the powers, the geometric powers, symbols are that much more powerful than rituals. So that, just a very simple piece of advice, if you're worried about demons and you're burning candles, that's like really slow motion. One really good symbol is worth trillions and trillions of candles. But late in the 20th century, we've come to understand that there is a third level beyond symbols, beyond the geometric, and they're called algorithms. And a genetic algorithmic develops as much faster than geometricity as geometricity does for arithmetic. The simple linear confidence which is there in ritual, empirical reality, which is changed and transformed into a symbolic geometricity, changes even further and more radically into what now would be called, and is called, in higher mathematics, a genetic algorithm. Now, let me just give you a few words and then we'll get back to our subject. Here's a book with a leopard. I don't know if the leopard's name is Baby, but it's the cover of a book of physics. It's called The Quark and the Jaguar. It's from a poem that contains this image, The Quark and the Jaguar, and it's by the Nobel Prize winning Murray Gell-Mann. He was at Caltech. He won the Nobel Prize for Physics in '69. He's also the head of the Santa Fe Institute. One of the world's great physicists. He's the Einstein of who's left. In his new book, The Quark and the Jaguar, page 19, published 1994 by the scientific publisher W.H. Freeman and Company. On page 310, genetic algorithms as complex adaptive system. So we're not only looking up from the way in which our feet are making footprints one step at a time to a horizon which geometrically expands, but we're now looking at something which is the whole sphere, the amphitheater, that includes the horizon as a simple plane among a universe. Now, the shift that happens here is the shift that happens when you move from arithmetic to geometry to trigonometry. When you move to a trigonometric world, you're no longer dealing with plane geometry, which is an advance over step-by-step counting arithmetic. But just as arithmetic gets transformed by geometry into planes and forms and simple cubes, trigonometry transforms geometry into something else that makes it available for we don't have a word in the English language for it, and so I made one up. Or rather, I borrowed the word from J.R.R. Tolkien, who noticed that we don't have a word. We have a word for catastrophe in English. When something really bad happens, it's a catastrophe. Well, when something really good happens, he said we should use the term eucatastrophe. A good catastrophe. The good catastrophe is that as our experience happens, linearity transforms into a geometricity, and a symbolic capacity comes out of that. But when that symbolic capacity is integrated fully, a completely new, a third level of transformation happens, where we move into a trigonometric realm, a realm where genetic algorithms, for the first time, become dreamable. The genetic algorithms are characteristic of what used to be known in ancient times as magic. It was called magic. And just as nature develops ritual and experience develops symbols, magic develops art. Art. Not just art, but persons. Because the person is a work of art. The best work of art. The art of person-making, as a therapist named Virginia Satir used to call people-making, is a real art. One can get really good at people making, and somebody who works upon themselves as a work of art becomes very, very good at this, very refined, very elegant. And we're going to see in our education that the person is a launch point for an even higher power, for a power that engenders literally the cosmos. How does a genetic algorithm work? It works because it is constantly able to adapt increasing complexity into a pattern. In other words, where the arithmetical standpoint bogs down very quickly, even in face of low-level geometricity, somebody who has just a ritual confidence in their existence completely bogs down, even on the level of being faced by problems in a geometric mode, which are actually, in terms of our capacities, very simple. For instance, I'm speaking to you literally one word at a time. But you're able to float above the one word at a time language because you're used to it and you've already made, most of you have made, these transitions. If you bring someone in off the street, and I'm not talking about the guys pushing the carts, I'm talking about very capable people, and you sit them in here, after about 20 minutes they blank out. They cannot hear. Because the one word at a time expectation of just this ritual existence that most people are bogged down in is incapable of hearing the way I talk. And it's not because I'm double talking. I'm not in an Orwellian newspeak. But I'm speaking in a very direct, personal, cosmic integrating way. Cosmic differentiating way. They will not hear it. Take a tape from any lecture and play it for any friend and clock and see how long it takes for them to blank out. One has to go through several transformations. And the first transformation that's coming up for us is the transformation from ritual to symbol via the mythology, which is there in experience. We need myth because it becomes for us another ocean, like nature but different from nature. It's like a parallel to nature. It's like a double to nature. Only out of the ocean of myth can come the symbolic self. Whereas out of the mysterious ocean of nature, the best that can come is existence. But existence happens in the now. It happens in the present. So that if one could keep oneself constantly instantaneous, you would do very well in existence. You would have a relationality with nature that would be seamless. So that a Zen master or a Taoist Shen or a yoga master who can keep the present instant continuously there, they are in nature in such a way that their objectivity is seamlessly in the mystery of nature. And one can refine oneself. It takes a long time. It takes an enormous amount of effort. And there are many perils along the way. But the super yogi, the Zen master, the Taoist Shen, is not the objective of the movement of life. Life has its cycle, it has its pattern, and it goes somewhere that we need to explore. So we need to know about these things. We need to know about these kinds of activities, just enough to know that that's possible and that's there, but move on. And part of moving on is understanding how ritual works, how existence actually happens, well enough that we can understand how it changes. How existence, when it's intense enough, flames. And the flames that are there for the intensity of existence make the heat and light and clouds that are the world of experience, the world of mythology, the world of language. Language literally flames out of existence into experience when ritual is intense enough. It's the narrowing, the compressing of the awareness of what you are doing that makes the ignition for language to happen. So that words are literally diamonds made out of the carbon of existence by pressure and heat. And it becomes a metaphor, very often in wisdom traditions. The diamond realm of realization is because one is able to speak language in an ultimate way. This is very difficult if we cram it all in at once, and that's why it takes a cycle of just patiently every Saturday for about a year to unfold the sense of how all this fits together and how it actually happens, and to sense in ourselves, yes, that's right. This is the way that it happens, because we're having reality checks by you checking with each other, you checking yourself, you checking me, you checking the situation in a number of ways, and that patiently, over that duration of time, one comes to being able to say, that's right. This is the way that our existence, our experience, our symbolic essence really happens and works together. And then, so as not to leave us at a high point way out there, we have a second year to bring all of that back and restore us right back to where we were. And we come back to the very beginning. And the beginning of this course was simply to take a walk from wherever you live around your neighborhood and come back home. That first project is the vignette. It's like a symbolic key of what this whole 2-year process is. We're just taking a walk in the neighborhood of what is real in this universe for us and coming back home, so that we will have taken a nice little tour and found out this is what's there. This is what actually operates, with the only proviso that it operates all the time, all of it. It doesn't portion itself out like we're portioning itself. We're giving it a proportionality because we're trying to develop a sense of ratio-ness. Now, notice that when you look with ritual eyes, you are looking to see the veracity of one thing at a time. Whereas the symbolic vision is looking to see two things brought into relationality at a time. The symbolic eye sees in terms of ratios, whereas the ritual eye sees in terms of singleness of image. A good ritual language has a word which corresponds to a thing. But a good symbolic language has its words which are relational juxtapositions of at least two, if not more. So that symbolic seeing is always relational, And ritual seeing, if it could be pressed to its ultimate, is one-dimensional. Now this makes for a very, very interesting quality when one comes to try to grasp what could we use to look at that would hold all of this information, all of this insight in a convenient way so that we could look at it and see what's there. What kind of hands could hold that instantaneous lightning of actual existence? And wouldn't you know it, that the best people on earth who have done this are the Japanese. Because the Japanese disposition, for a long, long time, maybe forever, has been to take other people's creative insights and refine them and polish them and make them smoother and simpler until they have exactly and only that. And then sell billions of them back to the same people. And before the Japanese got interested in taking American creativity and refining it and then selling it back to Americans, they took Chinese creativity and refined it, and, well, they didn't have too many customers in China. But the Japanese refinement of Chinese experience came to a honing at two particular moments in Japanese history. One of them was the early 1400s, and the other was the late 1600s. And we're going to take two geniuses of Japan, one from the early 1400s and one from the late 1600s, and we're going to try to use these two, their creative forms, to hold the slippery lightning of instantaneous nowness. The person from the early 1400s used drama, he used plays as the medium, and the person from the late 1600s used poetry. And somehow poetry and plays go together. There are two hands that use the medium of language and juxtaposition and balance in such a way that they allow us to handle what otherwise would be very difficult for us to handle at all. The playwright is named Zeami, Z-E-A-M-I, Zeami, and the poet is named Basho, B-A-S-H-O, Basho. And Zeami created the archetypal refinement of drama in Japan. The name for it is N-O-H, no drama. And Basho's poetry became the ultimate refinement of poetry. It became haiku. So that no drama and haiku poetry in Japan are the hands that we're going to use here at the end of the ritual section to try to hold in a light, elegant way the instantaneity of nowness, of existence, the presence of existence, in order to allow for us to observe how, when the moment is intensely real in existence, it all by itself flames into language. Let's hear it again. Let's hear it again. Language, in a peculiar way, is natural to the intensity of the presence of existence. When existence is exactly real enough, it speaks. Now, one of the apocryphal stories that is told in Asian wisdom of this is told in India. The sage Valmiki, whose name means white anthill. He's the writer who authored the great Indian epic, the Ramayana. And he was meditating in the forest in his usual manner, meditating so long that the white ants had built a hill over him. He'd sat still for maybe 40 years in the same spot. And in his meditation, he was such a mystical part of the forest that he was there, that when a hunter came along and with a bow and arrow shot one of the birds that was singing so brightly and illuminating the forest with its song, as soon as the bird died and fell to the ground, Valmiki uttered a curse that left a little wisp of soot in the forest where the hunter had been. And then, of course, he meditated on what had happened. He certainly hadn't meant to kill the hunter, and he hadn't meant for retribution, but it was an autonomic response that the curse came out is a response, as a reflex arc to that stimulus. Because he was only present, there was no morality, there was no consciousness of ethics or anything at all. There was just his sliver of lightning presence in the nature of the forest. And so the stimulus of the death of the song of the bird led to the response of the curse, and Valmiki then meditated upon the curse, and he noticed that it had a form. It had a form because it came out in two lines, a pair of lines. In other words, the words came out in such a way that the lines of the words, the two planes of the words, were parallel, were pairs. And so that form became the archetypal form for poetry in India. It's called the sloka. And all Indian classical literature is written in slokas. The Bhagavad Gita is written in slokas. All of the great philosophy, all of the great poetry. The Upanishads, all of them. And that when you put a pair of slokas together, you get 4 lines, you get what we call in English a quatrain. Now it turns out that the double line is also the archaic, truthful form of language in Hebrew poetry. If you look at something like the book of Job, which is classic Hebrew poetry, it's all written so that the paired lines, the sloka form, is also there. It turns out to be a world phenomenon that all deep, great language, which is reflexive of stimulation on the natural and existence response level, stimulus from nature, response from existence on the ritual level, has this double line, paired line form. Why, thought Valmiki, does language take this form? And in order for him to solve that, he told himself the ultimate development of a single 2-line to see where it would go. Where will this progression go? If I keep adding slokas to this initial sloka, where will it go? And that's how the Ramayana got written. So the Ramayana is the universal story of all life, from the single seed of a single response to a single stimulus. Notice how one could say, well, this is very esoteric, but notice that we're not teaching esoteric yoga. We're looking at how to be investigators of our own lives, because we want to know. We want to know who we are. We want to know who you are. We want to know what we're doing here. We want to know what is there to do. And we would like to know, can we think of things that we really like to do and actually do them? Is that possible? Will that be real? all of this hinges upon the way in which existence, when it gets compressed to a single moment, to the instant, and that the instant is held in that mode of holding the instant, one can universally observe in all great human wisdom traditions that language flames out of existence, and experience is literally the gift, the fire of existence. Experience is the fire of existence, of the stone of existence. So that, for instance, in China, when the great goddess made the vault of heaven and she finished, it was found that she had used all of the stones except one, and that one stone was left over out of the vault of heaven. And so it wasn't needed, and it was thrown away, and the stone happened to fall and fell on earth. And while it was on earth, it heard the Taoist of infinite time talking with the Buddhist of infinite space, and the conversation that they had, the stone overheard, and that story became the Dream of the Red Chamber, one of China's greatest novel. So the War and Peace of China. The Story of the Stone is how it's called in some English translations. We're going to see that language flames out of existence when existence is refined to its instant, and that is held. And you don't have to hold it very long before it happens. So in ritual now, we're looking at Zeami in drama and Basho in poetry to see how the Japanese refined language retrojectively so that they could also observe how when you condense ritual so that instant happens and that an art form is able to hold that instantaneousness, the audience as well as the performers experience the birth of language that happens right before them, happens within them. That's what we're doing. Now, it's very difficult if one were to take a philosophic standpoint or a metaphysical standpoint or any other standpoint. It would be very difficult to talk about this at all. We could get bogged down for years, for lifetimes, for millennia. The medieval formulation that was made by a man in Spain, Isidore, who was from Seville, Isidore of Seville, asked the kind of question, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? It's a question of refining down to the instant. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? And it was talked about for 600 or 700 years, and there was no answer found. And it was a total waste of time. Because any angels that would be there on the head of a pin would be so blended with the mystery of nature that they would not be observable at all as phenomena. And so it's a nonsense question. So our education, our tack, is to take a look at what we're doing lightly, not to make a big thing of it, but to see it clear enough so that we understand what we're doing has reverberations and repercussions that instantly help us to be more real in ourselves, with other people relationally, and in this reality, which we definitely, most definitely are. We're going to take a break. Here's how Murray Gell-Mann writes about genetic algorithms as complex adaptive systems. Since neural nets, that is the brain cells as neurons, which are arranged in nets of millions, if not billions, there are more neural cells in the brain than there are stars in the universe. Since neural nets are based on a crude analogy with learning in higher animals, One might ask whether there are also computer-based complex adaptive systems suggested by an analogy with biological evolution. Indeed, there are. They were pioneered by John Holland of the University of Michigan, a mainstay of the Santa Fe Institute, and they make use of genetic algorithm software, a special classifier system, and conventional computer hardware. So far, these systems have been used mostly for problems in which fitness is well defined as devising strategies for winning at checkers, or methods of installing wiring systems that minimize costs. However, there is no reason why the systems cannot be applied to other kinds of problems as well. And what happens here is that you take a limited set of instructions, compare them, and cross them over and let them exchange. What comes out is something new, a variation. It seems that new instructions are continually entered, and the ones at the bottom of the list are deleted to make room for them. And the phenomenon is almost as if there's a dying off of the old and a birthing of the new. And it becomes almost like the life process. And the interfacing becomes almost like sexual reproduction. Almost like the genetic meeting of the sperm and the egg. So that one notices in the computer system, on the genetic algorithmic lesson, that lesson shows us that what we're engaged in is not some kind of special fiction dreamed up off the edge of the universe, but we're participating in what is the spinal column, dead center, actual reality of what always happens everywhere. And rather than being exceptions, we are very good barometers of what is eternally always true. And so it's worthwhile for us to take a look at what we are and what we're doing. We don't have to look elsewhere. It's right here. Let's take a break. Looking ahead, in order for us to have some traction in the myth section, which is coming up in a month, the first thing that we're going to take is the ancient Sumerian myth of Inanna, the Queen of Heaven. Now, this translation by Diane Folkstein is extremely good. Very, very, very good. There is another version in this Penguin Classics, Poems of Heaven and Hell from Ancient Mesopotamia, so that you could get the Penguin Classics translation to compare with this, but get this one by Diane Folkstein. And there is a Jungian discussion of the myth of Inanna called Descent to the Goddess, a Way of Initiation for Women. Unlike a lot of the material that's out for women's initiation, which is a cultural response, this is really archetypal, eternally valid, basic. Inanna has been basic myth for more than 4,000 years, 5,000 years. She is wise. The woman who wrote this lived about 2300 BC, and her father was Sargon of Akkad, the first king to establish the Fertile Crescent from the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. And next week, or in a month, when we come to this, I'll show you a portrait of her father that survived in a beaten gold mask that was placed on him. So this writing of Inanna was written by one of the most intelligent and elegant women writers ever, and the fact that she lived 4,300 years ago shouldn't make any difference to us at all. She's still very current because writing on this level is forever. But in order to bring out, to tease out the full nuances of the developments of Inanna. Two books that we're going to use after the myth section and the symbol section, you should get at the same time as you buy Inanna. The other two are both by women also. One of them is Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. It's a novel, and you can find it in paperback, and there are a number of editions. It's been out for years. It's been a bestseller for years, since the 20s. So there are plenty of used paper copies. Any copy will be okay. Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. The other one is by Suzanne Langer, called Philosophy in a New Key. And I believe the paperback is published by Harvard University Press. So that when you get them, try and get all three of these together, because Suzanne Langer's deep symbolic understanding of music and myth goes along with Virginia Woolf's deep artistic understanding of stream of consciousness, present moment, instantaneous reality. And both those are 20th century, early 20th century women trying to understand implications that are fixed forever in Eduhana's myth of Inanna. So those three, try and get those three together. Okay. Let's come back to our haiku and our no drama. Let's come back to Zeami with his no drama and Basho with his haiku. Let's come first of all to Zeami. We're going to take a single no play by Zeami. And this play is entitled Izutsu. I-Z-U-T-S-U. Izutsu. Izutsu is a word that translates as a phrase, and it means at the well. So that on the stage, whenever the no drama is presented, in the center of the stage is this well, and in order to find the well, there's this stone embankment around, the circle of stones. So it's the circle of stones, that low wall around the well. And this well exists in the courtyard of an abandoned monastery, a haunted, abandoned monastery. And in the play, there are two parts, a pair of parts, just like a pair of lines in the sloka. A pair of parts. In the first part, a traveling priest visits a temple which, according to tradition, was built on the site of the house occupied by Narihira and his wife, one of the great heroes of Japanese history. And by 1425, when this was written, he was already a hero. And so by 1990, of course, Narihira is like Beowulf. He's an ancient hero who's involved with sort of the archetypal courage in Japanese culture of existence. But it's not Narihira. He was a hero in life. It is his wife who is the hero in the transcendental realms after death forever. And it is she who comes to the well, and a traveling priest who's in this haunted courtyard of this old monastery with the whispering pines, the autumn leaves skittering around, and he's meditating. And as he's meditating, this woman comes in and comes to the bank of the well and looks in. And reflected on the water deep down in the well is the full moon in the sky. And it's slowly, patiently moving west in the night, in the early dawn. And the west in Japan is always the paradisical promised land. The west is the home of the Amida Buddha, Amitabha, so that heaven is in the west. so that the moon is moving towards paradise, and the moon as a symbol for that religious experience which we call in the West by the name the Mahayana, the kind of Buddhism which is universal. Not the Hinayana where a monk will win salvation through achievement of nirvana for himself, but the Mahayana where no one is going to accept salvation until all sentient beings are saved together. So the moon is the symbol of the bodhisattva, who's the helper who keeps coming back, though capable of enlightenment, always comes back to help others. And so here in this no drama, Zeami has brought all of the values of Japanese culture of the time and put them into one succinct vehicle, so permanently positioned that it is like a universal stamp of a pattern of truth about how life and death are polarities that if they were left alone would be at such odds with each other that they would not meet, and that the arithmetical attempt of existence to make life and death meet would be like one just having crossed eyes. In other words, on an arithmetical level, there's no way that the two eyes can be blended into a single focus. On the arithmetical level, on the ritual level, one would end up with crossed eyes. Not with an integrated vision within, but with crossed eyes without. So that very often, in the wisdom tradition, demons always have crossed eyes because they're trying on a mechanical level to do what needs to be done on higher powers, on interior level. Because the two eyes make one image within through interiorization. And it's this movement of existence within that provides the fuel for the flame of language to happen. So, in the first of two parts, a pair of parts, a traveling priest visits a temple which, according to tradition, was built on the site of the house occupied by Narahira and his wife, so that this well was there before the monastery was even built, and is there after it's been abandoned and ghostly and dilapidated and haunted, and the well is all that's left of the home life of this famous couple. The site of an old wooden well curb, half hidden by Suzuki grass, and of an ancient tombstone recalls to mind their famous love story. Because the only way that the polarity of life and death can be interiorized and blended is through love. If you try to force life and death together, exteriorly you end up with crossed eyes, with not being able to see anything, with being blind through confusion. Whereas love is the interiorization of the polarity of life and death so that they come to a unified focus. Love provides an interior, unified focus of the conundrum of life and death, which otherwise would be a polarity that would be insoluble. It would be insoluble tragic, because life would be only what it is and nothing else. And when it was over, it would be gone forever. And death would be an oblivion that has no contact, no interface with life whatsoever. But love can only happen out of the instant of the present. If there is no instantaneous present, there's no way that the flame of language, the interiorization, the reality of love can happen. And so this no drama is all about that instant which is kept continuous by the phantom of the wife coming back to that well, and is visible only by the old priest and his meditative insight being able to see this happening. So when the no drama Izutsu starts, the audience has to be brought into tune, into sympathy with the old traveling priest. Otherwise, there's no way they could see what's going on. So that the first character that comes out in the no drama is called the waki. The contact by which the audience is going to be able to participate with what's going to go on stage. So when the waki comes in, it's a sign for the audience to quiet down, not only to not talk, but to set themselves to be with that character, whatever that character is. In this case, it's a traveling old priest in a haunted monastery ground. And that the well somehow is almost hidden by this Suzuki grass. Later on, this very grass will become an image in one of Basho's haiku. Let me take a moment and flash up. This is a little paragraph of discussion from one of the best books ever done. It's called An Introduction to Haiku, Harold Henderson. A long time ago in the early 1960s, Japan Airlines ran a haiku contest, and they were absolutely shocked because they got 70,000 entries. And they had no idea that anyone was interested in this country. And so the Japan Society put out a little pamphlet called How to Write Haiku in English by Harold Henderson. And they had so many requests for it that they finally sold it to a publisher, and Tuttle still publishes it. Well, Henderson, in this book, Introduction to Haiku, is the first real book on haiku. It came out in 1958 in the English language. There were collections of haiku before then. I'll show you the early ones next week. But they were great, big, expensive $100 books back when $100 would buy you a car. This is the first time, and in his discussion about haiku, he's taking care to let English readers know that to translate a Japanese haiku into English is almost impossible. You have to have a little bit of background about it, a little bit of smarts, and this is what he's saying, that there is a haiku which in Japanese pronunciation runs Natsugusa ya Sawanomo domo ga Yumi no ato. Henderson writes, it is almost impossible to reproduce this in English because we have no proper words. Why do we have no proper words? Because we have never had the kind of stimulus response reflex arc from existence the way that the Japanese have. So that our language has been impoverished about having this very quality. Except for the fact, and Henderson didn't know this in 1957 when he was writing this book, except for the fact that this very lack was noticed by an American in the late 19th century. His name was Ernst Fellenosa. And Fellenosa noticed it because he was in China and he was trying to translate Chinese characters into English, and he realized that English words don't work the way Chinese characters work. But Fellinosa was an art critic and not a master of language, and so he brought the problem to the attention of a young, brash American from Ketchum, Idaho, named Ezra Pound. And Pound had enough chutzpah and genius, and arrogance and genius, and transcendental qualities and arrogance and genius. He had all of those, and those are not redundant. That Pound found that there were some women American poets who had unconsciously put their finger on the very qualities that were necessary for translating Chinese into English, and that the first of these was Emily Dickinson. Because Emily Dickinson's language is so spry that it's almost like American haiku. That sometimes Emily Dickinson uses 19th century American English in a Japanese Zen way. And that if you go back to Emily Dickinson with a Zen mind and you read her, she blows you out. She's too much for words, literally. She says more than anyone could have possibly heard at that time. Because people at that time were struggling with the long lines of Walt Whitman, where the lines were so long that sometimes it took pages to get the line completely out. Whereas Emily Dickinson, who was like the female pair to Whitman, where he went for the long line of the masculine cosmos in a breath, she went for the silence that's there after you've said all that. That her poetry were images that were flashed so quickly in front of you that you experienced not so much the image, but the fact that something had been shown you and taken away instantly. And you experienced the vacuous, missing, absent silence, and that's what her heart was all about. Because Emily Dickinson never found a real love in her life, but she knew what it was and knew she didn't have it. And that's where her poetry becomes universal genius. Like Inanna, Dickinson will be read 4,000 years from now. No doubt. But two women in the early 20th century associated with Pound had already begun to work on the aesthetics of Emily Dickinson vis-a-vis trying to translate Chinese, and they were Amy Lowell and Florence Askew. They were Boston ladies. Amy Lowell was gorgeous, beautiful socialite who went through some kind of an illness, and she gained weight, and she couldn't stand to be with people. She became sociophobic, and so she was only living at night, alone, sequestered in a house, with the memories of having been the most beautiful woman alive, and now ugly and not approachable. And her whole genius went into trying to find out what is real in the universe that allows me to be turned inside out. And Amy Lowell, as a Boston Brahmin, became a poetic shamaness. And she got interested in how Emily Dickinson's instantaneous images left a reverberant silence in their wake that was as important as the image itself. And she teamed up with Florence Askew to try to translate the great Chinese poet Du Fu, to translate his Chinese characters by a modification of Emily Dickinson's poetic. And Ezra Pound realized that Amy Lowell's work with the Chinese translation was very much in tune with his, only Ezra Pound was trying to go back to, like a man would, back to the philosophic basis of it, but Pound, instead of going back to Taoism, went back to Confucius, went back to the Confucian order, thinking that language was Confucian. So Pound and Lowell teamed up, and they made a school of American poetry called imagists. Imagists. That these words do not stand for things, but they present images that are meant to only flash there and then go and leave a reverberant silence, a space. Now, while both Lowell and Pound were attuned to Chinese culture, the young genius that was coming up, younger than Pound, younger than Amy Lowell, who really got the Japanese point of refinement and understood what Zeami was doing to the nth degree, was W.B. Yeats. Because Yeats was not so much an imagist looking for some symbolic aesthetic theory, he was a real poet who wanted to say magic things. He wanted to use a magic language that would bring reality into play. Yeats was the kind of youngster, when he was a teenager, he used to walk on the bottom part of a ravine, and one of his favorite uncles walked on the top of the ridge and would send him telepathic messages. And when they got back from the walk, he would ask young Willie Yeats about the conversation that they had had, and made sure that he really had second sight, not only to hear a word or two, but to actually know what the conversation was about. Yeats's father, who was an artist, had moved the family to London about the time that Madame Blavatsky was opening up her salon in London, and young teenager William Yeats, at about 17, showed up at her apartment one day, and she was busy talking with someone. She had several huge rooms that linked together, and she was talking to someone about occult matters, and motioned for the young man just to wait there in the parlor. And there was a German cuckoo clock, and he stood there in front of the cuckoo clock in his lanky, slim quality, and little bird came out and chimed and went back in. And when the person left, Madame Blavatsky got up and came over to him and looked at him very closely, because the clock had never worked. She'd had it for a long time, many years. And so she invited the 17-year-old teenage W.B. Yeats to come to all of her occult soirees, and she always told people, leave him alone. He's here to watch us. Yeats is the one who threw Aleister Crowley out of the Order of the Golden Dawn. He said, esoteric schools are not reform schools. Yeats, along with Jung, is one of the only two real magicians in the early part of the 20th century, except for maybe Manly Hall. Yeats understood, with a penetrating eye of the poetic magas, that what Fellinosa was doing with the poetics of the Chinese character. The Chinese character is a written medium for poetry, is one of his little books. What Fellinosa was doing, what Amy Lowell was doing, what Ezra Pound was doing, had been handled by the Japanese centuries before, because the Japanese, while using Chinese ideograms, had to translate them into Japanese usage. And the Japanese translation from Chinese went through this whole problem area. And that it was Zeami who first of all solved the problem of taking the Japanese language from its instantaneous core and transforming the shell of the Chinese characters into Japanese characters. And literally made Japanese as a different language from Chinese for the first time. Yeah, there was Japanese language before. It was used as a kind of a commerce, low level. After Zeami, it's raised to high art. There is a Japanese literature that's really Japanese. The earliest Japanese literature, about 400 years before him, comes from Lady Murasaki, The Tale of Genji. But it's all court etiquette. It's complex. The Tale of Genji is a genius novel. All the great writers of that period were women. And they used the intricacies of the Chinese language to show court intrigue and mysteries of Taoist interpenetration. But Zeami brought, for the very first time, a distinctly Japanese character to the language. So that no drama is the first great art form in Japan. And some 200 years, 250 years later, Basho would refine Zeami. It's like Zeami made a sword out of language, and Basho put a glint on the edge of the sword. Only one glint. So that in a single haiku, Basho would sum up the entirety of Japanese reality. So in this poem, which I read in the haiku by Basho, the translation in English, Natsugusa stands for the quick-growing plants of summer. Suwanomo literally means the strong ones, a name for medieval warriors, somewhat archaic even in Basho's time. Domo is a plural suffix. Yume means dream, as overtones of splendor or lives like dreams. And ato, a noun, means basically after. It includes the ideas of relic, trace, aftermath, what is left behind. So the literal English translation would be summer grasses, the afterword of strong men's dreams. The original, however, conveys a strong sense of grief, due at least in part to the martial role of the language, suwamono domo, and the crack of the following ato. Basho, for all his gentleness and his zen, was a samurai by birth and was living in an age when samurai were no longer doing deeds of glory. I wish that some genius could find the proper English for this haiku. After 25 years of trying, the best that I can do is this. Summer grass, of stalwart warriors' splendid dreams, the aftermath. In other words, after all the samurai machinations on this site, the only thing that's still real afterwards is just summer grass, overgrown. In the haiku of Basho, what is brilliantly there is just simply summer grass. And summer grass, which is quick growing, means that it's overgrown. It isn't cut grass, it's just from the seed and grown, and it will die off like that. Like the California wild wheat or wild ryegrass. That as soon as someone sees that, that summer grass is the instantaneous present of that moment. And that all of the samurai qualities of action and willfulness and war and violence and everything that has happened on that site have had no effect, have not changed one iota, the fact that summer grass just grows the way it always does. It is this grass which covers the well, which the ghost woman comes in Isutsu. So here it is again, in two parts, like a sloka, like a double line, universal quality of the way in which language creates experience. A traveling priest visits a temple which, according to tradition, was built on the site of the house occupied by Narihira and his wife. The site of an old wooden well curb, half hidden by Suzuki grass, and of an ancient tombstone recalls to mind their famous love story. In part 2, the heroine, the Shiti, as the Waki is the first person there, and the main person carrying the movement is the Shiti. In part 2, the heroine, dressed in her husband's princely robe and headgear. In other words, a woman wearing a man's headgear and a man's robe. She's wearing her husband's clothes. She's within the worldly persona of her husband. She is the soul within her husband's clothes. The heroine, dressed in her husband's princely robe and headgear, performs an utsuri mai, an impersonation dance. She not only wears his robe and his headgear, but she goes through a dance appropriate to the robe and the headgear. She's doing a ritual which would have been characteristic of her husband hundreds of years after he has died. In this case, it's accompanied by 2 drums, a small hand drum and a very large drum. And always in Japanese no drama there's a flute. So on the side there's this little orchestra of 3 people, a large drum, a small drum, and a flute. And the flute is, according to our Western ear, slightly high, too high a pitch and slightly dissonant. A very high off-pitch dissonance, so that there's a wail quality to it. So that there's nothing comforting whatsoever in the music of a no drama. It's like the teeth-grinding edge of a sound which has no place to be. It doesn't fit in any register at all, and so it's an orphaned sound that wails its way. And the drums provide a kind of a rhythm that has in no way a syncopation with the language. It's always that the language is out of rhythm. Now there are several modes in Japanese no drama, occasionally where there is, for each syllable, a beat, and they're together. And then there's a mode where for each drum beat, each syllable, there are 2 drum beats. And then there's a mode, which is used here in Isutsu, where I think that the ratio is something like 7 to 12 to 8. 12 to 8. 12 syllables and 8 beats. So that one is conscious all the time that something is not fitting. There's too much language for the ritual existence pace, so that existence is haunted by excess language that has no place to be. So that the rhythm of existence itself is painfully showing all the time that there's unembodied experience, and this enforces the ghostly feeling of the whole thing. Now this play, Isutsu, so affected W.B. Yeats that he wrote his own version of it called At the Hawk's Well. And next week I'll show you some photographs from the Irish production in Dublin at the Abbey Theatre, which was so colossal that it blew out Dublin society at the time. Lady Gregory, who sort of took over Madame Blavatsky's position of being like the metaphysical aunt for Yeats. Yeats was the kind of man who always needed to have the occult, wiser, older woman around, because he needed to be able to trust the fact that he was seeing these fandom wholenesses right. And so Lady Gregory became that for him after Madame Blavatsky, ensuring that he would have access to a woman's mature wisdom about the world, so that he could check himself, because he kept looking so penetratingly at life that he would go through it, he would poke through it. And a lot of times Yeats would scare himself, because he would find himself, walking through the frame of reference and finding that he didn't know where he was. When he got older, he was able to just float in those realms. The climax of part 2 is reached when the wife, in her intense longing for the past, identifies herself, as it were, with her husband, and reclining on the well curb sees his image in place of her own reflected in the still water beside her. In other words, she has put on his clothes. She has danced his movements. And when she goes to the well and looks in, for an instant she sees him and not herself. She has so given her identity to him that she has become him, and he has blinked back into existence for an instant, and he lives again because of her love, her selflessness, of giving up her place in the universe to him. Day dawns, the vision fades, and nothing remains but dreary reality which fills the priest with sadness and regret. Why? Because she is also a ghost. She is also a phantom. She is also dead. But because of her deep, abiding love and the power of the instantaneousness of the reality of she giving herself completely so that he could be, that there's no way that that can be erased from reality. And that someone who can see, like an old priest in a haunted monastery grounds would be able to see, somebody who's capable of meditation, of being conscious of the instantaneous, would see that this does, in fact, always occur. Every night, on this spot, her ghost comes in and gives herself up so that his ghost can flash into reality for an instant and be again. And then as the sun comes up, as day dawns, they both vanish, and there's just a deserted, overgrown grass monastery ground. Now, the quality that Zeami brings out, the quality of experience, the Japanese word for it is yugen, Y-U-G-E-N, yugen. It means ostensibly the mysteriously beautiful. It means something that is so mysterious and at the same time so beautiful that we could hardly believe that this world could have such a thing. It's as Zeami says in his theory of language, yugen allows for experience to have a blossom so unique and rare that if it didn't occur again and again, we would not believe it would be possible. That we could be sensitive enough to know such things. That we could be refined enough and elegant enough to understand such things. That in a world that is so stupid and so brutal, so colossally a junkyard, that we could still have enough elegance, sense of beauty, and sensitivity to experience the actuality of yugen, a rare, unique blossom of experience. Shows us that we are not ever lost so far that we are beyond hope. That enlightenment can come to us even in this world. That the bodhisattvas are at work, the moon is full, love actually happens, and interiorizes life and death to a single focus, that they exist together in a wholeness which is quite real. This quality can only be accomplished if the language, if the ritual drama has what Zeami calls straightforwardness. The Japanese word is sugunaru. Straightforwardness. That is to say, the Japanese Zen drama of the 1400s is very much like the Mindfulness Sutra of the Buddha about 1900 years before. In the Mindfulness Sutra, in the Satipatthana Sutra, the Buddha was talking about how if we continuously and methodically align all of our perception, we will find that perception, the entire range of it, even though it is a range, can be turned 90 degrees and shown on edge like a buzzsaw, and it cuts through illusion. But we have to learn to open the fan of perception complete and to turn it as an ensemble on its edge, and then we cut through the illusion of this world. And when we do so, we find that it penetrates in such a way that this straightforwardness reveals a blossoming out on the other side. That when we penetrate through the world of illusion, we don't fall into nothingness, but we penetrate through a shell that seems like nothingness to the other side, where blossoms like mysterious beauty actually happen, actually occur. The whole point, the whole resonant realization of this is that consciousness is a blossom like that on the other side. And that the basic, empirical, practical truth is that there is no consciousness that comes out of ritual. Consciousness comes out of symbols. So that we have to have ritual in order to have existence become real. But we have to interiorize ritual, interiorize existence, so that experience happens, and then mature out of experience the objective reality of symbols. And that when symbols do their work, a whole other realm of consciousness comes out of that. That there's an ecology, and that if we go with the ecology, all of this works. We don't have to cross our fingers and hope it works. It does work. But that's the way it happens. And no one has to be a genius or super yogi. This is the way life works in its actuality. Question: why doesn't everyone know this? Answer: because the resistances to have the courage to face the peril of this are so rampant that they cover up like a fragmented house of mirrors and do not allow us to have the patience and tenacity to actually just be for that instant that it takes to get the traction for truthful language to happen. And without truthful language happening, there's not an experience realm which could be interiorized and brought into symbolic objectivity. And without that, there's no way consciousness can come out. Question: what is it that comes out that parades itself as consciousness? Answer: fictions of the ego. Egotistical fictions. And it's like the planet itself is a haunted grounds of an abandoned monastery filled with ghosts that go through their little scenarios, their little routines, their little skits, in endless cross-eyed confusion. The word for that in the Buddha's time was samsara. Let's stop there and we'll come back next week.